Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Snyder. Thank you so much for joining me, and welcome to another episode of the CD and Vinyl Guys. Please welcome my co-host, Chris Propfe. How are you?
I'm good, Brendan. How are you?
I'm great. Glad to have you here. So for this particular episode, we're going to be doing an interesting discussion topic here, one that I think that is on a lot of people's minds with the way the industry has been going. As bands grow and change, members certainly come and go throughout the course of the history of a band. And as it is today with the way the music industry is, more bands tend to work themselves based on name recognition than anything else. And downloading and all those sort of things and less physical media, most people don't pay attention to who are in the lineups of bands. So name recognition certainly is a really important thing to these bands. So I really wanted to ask the question and discuss with you, Chris, should bands continue after changing members, or should they change their band name? And so I've got some questions here and things that we'll kick this off with and kind of see where it goes. And first one up, I just wanted to ask the question, which do you think is more important for a band, the singer or maybe the musicians, i.e. like a guitarist or something? Which makes the sound of a band?
I would say right away the singer.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was coming up with bands to show for this discussion, it was mostly when they changed the singer, because that's what you recognize, I think, first. I mean, every guitarist has their own sound, of course, but I really feel that the singer is the identity for the band.
It's definitely the first thing I think that most people would associate, because the singer generally is also the front man of the band. The face of the band. Even a lot of times they're the ones that become the prominent image on album covers and all those sort of things. Even if it is a true band effort, that sometimes happens. Right. And so I tend to agree. I think in most cases a singer is the most prominent person, and if you don't have the singer in the band, for me it's kind of hard pressed that you continue calling yourself the name of the band. But there's exclusions to that too. So I did want to point out, Jim Morrison of the Doors, definitely defining of the sound of the Doors. But, the Doors continued on and put out 2 more albums without him, which I think are fantastic. And the musicians of the Doors, Ray Manzarek on his organ, certainly a prominent sound for the band, and guitar player Robbie Krieger and the way that he played, definitely defining of it. Those albums sound like the Doors, but of course, not having Jim Morrison, people weren't interested. And then you've got, David Coverdale of Whitesnake, where he can replace everybody around him. But as long as David Coverdale's in the band, it's still Whitesnake, right? So we've got a lot of these, I think. Steven Tyler, Aerosmith, Steve Perry of Journey. And this one might be, a one to argue or whatever, but Sebastian Bach of Skid Row. I'm really excited to see where Skid Row goes with their new singer and this long gestating new album. But to me, the last so many releases haven't really sounded like Skid Row. They're good, but they don't sound like Skid Row. To me, Sebastian Bach made made the sound of the band, despite how good the musicians are. But in those rare instances where I think the musicians are actually maybe more prominent than vocalists, Eddie Van Halen of Van Halen. And obviously they did change singers and were successful and worked with that, from David Lee Roth to Sammy Hagar. And then again, this is an arguable one. To me, David Gilmour of Pink Floyd makes the sound of Pink Floyd more than Roger Waters, and his writing and his lead vocal that he does on it. And then you've got like Steve Howe of Yes, Tony Iommi on guitar. A lot of people would say Ozzy is the sound of Black Sabbath, and without Ozzy, there is no Black Sabbath and all of that. But to me, if you didn't have those riffs by Tony Iommi, you wouldn't have Black Sabbath. I can see all the members changing, and certainly we've seen that happen. I mean, they changed. We start with Ozzy, and we go to Ronnie James Dio, and we go to Ian Gillan, and we go to Glenn Hughes, and then eventually we go to the Tony Martin years, right? And they're changing all the members around them. So, I mean, maybe it's because those albums have been out and we've listened to those and we saw that progression. But I can't imagine Black Sabbath without hearing those Black Sabbath riffs and stuff. So, I could go both ways with it. I do think it comes down to the band that we're talking about as to whether it's going to work changing a musician or changing a singer. So on that same topic, another question being, do you think there's a minimum number of band members in order to keep a band going? If it's down to only one, does that work? Or do we need at least 2 or 3 to keep a name going?
I mean, technically, if you've got one of the original members, I guess technically you can still call them whatever band that is.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say just the guitarist is left. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know. You can still call them the name, but you kind of want to see it. I'm going to go back to the singer. I still feel like the singer should still be there because that's the sound of the band. You know, like you said, that's the identity of the band. So maybe the singer and somebody else. So maybe like 2 people at least.
So what was your take then in terms of either AC/DC or Van Halen? Speak to either one.
Yeah.
Both changed their lead vocalist for different reasons, right? But both were extremely successful before and after with that change in vocalist. And I always think it is easier for a band to change lead vocalists if the previous vocalist passed away or died. Because people aren't expecting the reunion. They're not still looking for the last person, right? But when, in like David Lee Roth's case from Van Halen, he chose to go solo, they were always calling for Van Halen reunions, but managed to find success. To me, that had to do with Eddie Van Halen's guitar playing. But what's your take on some of those more popular bands that did that, or even Black Sabbath, who changed vocalists? I know you're a huge Black Sabbath fan.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say too, because you had mentioned a few of those bands. And what's interesting is when they change lead singers, I feel like their whole sound changed. Like Van Halen with David Lee Roth sounds different than Van Halen with Sammy Hagar.
Very true, yeah.
It's almost like they're 2 different bands. You had mentioned Pink Floyd as well. And you were talking about Roger Waters versus David Gilmour. Went back further, Syd Barrett versus David Gilmour, because when Syd Barrett was in the band, they were more psychedelic.
Right.
And suddenly David Gilmour comes in, and I believe the first proper album that he came in on was More.
He was on Saucer.
Saucer Full of Secrets, he did some guitar work, but Syd Barrett was gone at this point.
Right.
And, but the band started to slowly change their sound. So I don't know. It's an interesting topic. And I'm blanking on the original question because I'm just talking.
Well, the idea was sort of how many original members need to be there. And then you were reverting back to this idea of singer is really the one that needs to be there. And so I just was pointing out or saying, how do you feel then about like AC/DC changing from Bon Scott to Brian Johnson? We're both big AC/DC fans. And I know you're not as big in the Van Halen fan world, but you are in Black Sabbath. And all 3 of those bands had success. I mean, when we go let's talk Black Sabbath for a minute. From Ozzy to Ronnie James Dio, you're right. I do think the sound changed. It definitely changed from, sorry if I can get to point to it, right? Technical Ecstasy, Never Say Die, to that. That was a much heavier return for them. So, and it was also darker and more gothic and style. And, that's what Ronnie James Dio brought to it that I think was exactly what Black Sabbath needed. So even though the sound changed, it changed for the better or equally as good, however you want to think of it, kind of a thing. And I would say the same in the case of AC/DC.
I think what happens, though, is it starts to divide the fans. If you think about Sabbath, you have those people who only like the Ozzy years. It's not Sabbath if it's not Ozzy. And then you have other people who are like, no, I like the Dio years because that's when I got into Black Sabbath. So I like those. I only like Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules. But then you've got the Tony Martin fans as well. But then you've got fans who like Ozzy, Dio, and Tony Martin. So I think once you start to change pieces of the band, you start to divide the fans.
Right. I mean, like I held up, in here, this one here, 7 Star, right, which has Glenn Hughes on it. And it was originally intended to be a Tony Iommi solo record, but the label forced him into calling it Black Sabbath. And this is a particular case where they did change the sound consciously, or Tony Iommi did, because it was meant to be a solo record. And so it doesn't really sound like a Black Sabbath album, yet it has the name. Unfortunately, the record label forced him into doing that. Right. And I, before really learning and understanding all of the behind the scenes stuff with Black Sabbath and how that developed, I used to think to myself, why did they call it Black Sabbath? This doesn't sound like Black Sabbath. It's so far removed.
Right.
But then, you get into the political inner workings of everything, and you find out and you kind of go, oh, it was never intended to be. Like, I could accept it far better once I learned that.
Right.
If it had been a solo Tony Iommi record, though, I don't think it would have done anything more than it had under the Black Sabbath name. So I don't think in his case, changing band name or anything would have done anything for him. The name recognition alone of Sabbath was what was keeping, everything going at that point.
I think what helps too is, let's think about Iron Maiden for a second. Mm-hmm. When Paul Di'Anno was their lead singer, they were becoming a big band.
Right.
But they didn't reach that superstardom until Bruce entered.
Right.
So it's almost like the fan base that they gained with Bruce Dickinson, a lot of them didn't even know about Paul Di'Anno. Mm-hmm. So for them, Bruce was their first singer. You know what I mean? And it's like, oh, wait, Iron Maiden has 2 other albums without Bruce. So like sometimes when a singer comes in, they almost catapult that band. Yeah, Deep Purple's another one. Like there's not a lot of people who know that Rod Evans was the original singer for Deep Purple.
They've got 3 albums with him.
Right.
But, Ian Gillan comes in, and they did a orchestrated album prior to this, Concerto for Group and Orchestra. But this album, their first rock album, In Rock, perfect title for it. And a lot of people, and I think, and people would even argue that on like Quiet Riot, which I've got there behind me. Even though that was their debut album worldwide and here in the US and their most popular lineup, they had 2 albums before that out in Japan. And so they had a different lineup for that. So when people talk about whether or not there's any original members left, you always get this argument of, Deep Purple technically only has 1 original member left, the drummer, Ian Pace, in the current lineup of the band today. But if we talk about their most famous lineup, we've still got Roger Glover on bass, Ian Gillan, the vocalist, and Ian Pace, the drummer. So I always look at it and say, well, Deep Purple has 3 original members, at least from their heyday. And so that's always something to get in and debate on that. And of course, they're another one that changed vocalists with adding an unknown David Coverdale before Whitesnake, hugely successful at that, and proving that they could even change their guitar player to Tommy Bolin and be successful there. And of course, bring in Joe Lynn Turner. So,
and each of those albums sounds completely different.
They do. It's like Black Sabbath. I mean, there's night and day differences between it. And I think some of this too is that each of those people, like David Coverdale, was unknown at that time, and he carried on the success that had been built up with Machine Head. But if David Coverdale hadn't gone on to form Whitesnake and be hugely successful with Whitesnake, I don't know if the albums that he was on would be looked upon as great as they are today. Yes, I think Burn is a fantastic album, and a lot of people think so. Maybe it would still be thought of, but I do think his celebrityism from Whitesnake made those albums more than they are. And I think that's the case with Joe Lynn Turner coming into Rainbow, and Ian Gillan coming into Black Sabbath, and so forth. It's these people were big in their own right, or went on to be big, and they lend something to it. So as the bands get older, and some of these bands been around 50 years now, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, new fans that come into it are just seeing all of the famous members. They're not hearing it or experiencing it as it happened, which might have been an entirely different way, to feel things at that time.
And it's interesting when you showed those Doors albums before. I have those as well. And it sounds like the Doors, but without Jim Morrison, to me, it's not the Doors. And I want to show another example. Iron Butterfly fans out there.
Yes.
Doug Ingle was the original singer. He was the organ player. Well, he left. Iron Butterfly tried to continue, and they came out with 2 albums, Scorching Beauty and Sun and Steel. and the guitarist Eric Braun ended up taking over vocals. But to me, it's just not Iron Butterfly anymore. Mm-hmm. So, bands try to change the singer, and a lot of times it just doesn't work. I mean, if we think about Priest with Tim Ripper Owens.
Yeah.
I happen to like those albums, but to a lot of people, that's not Priest anymore. When Maiden went to Blaze Bayley, I'm a big Blaze Bayley fan.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of people, the X Factor and Virtual 11, they just don't even listen to. They almost don't even acknowledge them because Bruce is not singing for them.
Yeah, and it's a real shame because both Blaze and Tim Ripper Owens are fantastic singers. I think they did great work. Yeah. But like anything, a band member is an ingredient in the band. Yeah. And let's say you got 4 of them and they're all putting in 25% of what they're doing. And you take that 25% out and you've got 3/4 of something left and you add another 25% of something different. Right. It is going to change it, obviously. And maybe even more so to that, a lot of times when the band members are changing, it's also other things that are happening. Music industry is changing, musical styles are changing. So there's fallouts with the band because they're not as popular as they once were. And so in come new members at periods in bands usually that are turmoil, changes in the industry. And I think that often hurts it as well, but bands will be changing due to the new member, but also changing due to the times of things. And of course, I think we experienced that with Iron Maiden and those 2 albums with Blaze, and even the ones with Tim Ripper Owens and Judas Priest, even though they attempted to make a Painkiller Part 2 with Jugulator, I don't think they really stepped into their own until the follow-up album after that, Demolition.
Right.
So I wanted to just top that one off that we were talking about with minimum number of bands, in that there's bands like James Gang that famous with Joe Walsh. And then their bassist and drummer continued on after he left. So you lose both your guitar and your vocalist. And you've got the 2, rhythm section guys now bringing in this case, they brought in a separate vocalist and a separate guitar player. The Yardbirds did the same thing with the drummer and bassist continuing on, but they even for a while in the 80s went under a different name, Box of Frogs, and brought in other famous guitar players. So there's instances where you lose one member and you're losing not only your most famous instrument sound, but your famous, vocal sound. And that is where I always really question it when it's just a bassist and drummer or something like that, and they've really kind of lost everything. But let's talk, or maybe continue the topic that we had kind of just briefly touched on. What happens if there's only one original member, but specifically if it's only a drummer? How do you feel? I'm not going to see
them.
Right, you're not going to see them, right? I'm kind of the same way. I mean, however, we did touch on the Deep Purple aspect of that because Ian Pace is technically the only original member. So while he is only one original guy left, they still have other famous members. And of course, they've replaced the members, like John Lord, I think on keyboards is a defining aspect of Deep Purple, almost to the degree that Ritchie Blackmore on guitar. But they brought Don Airey on keyboards, who's played with Rainbow, Ozzy, and so many others, Black Sabbath. And he just has done a phenomenal job. And you bring in then guitar player Steve Morrison. I know a lot of people don't like him as much as Ritchie Blackmore or whatever, but I think they have replaced these other members with some really standout musicians. Steve Morse is guitar player with Dixie Drex, so he comes with a whole lineage. Don Airey comes with a lineage. So whether you look at them as still Deep Purple or you say it's sort of like a supergroup Deep Purple, and Leonard Skinner's kind of the same way, right? They've only got the guitar player is the only original member left in the lineup at this point. Used to be Leon Wilkinson, their keyboardist and their bassist, but they've each passed away. Or the bassist was Leon Wilkinson. They've each passed away. So now you've only got Gary Rosington, and he's been ill lately, but they've always replaced the members with other famous members. They got Ricky Medlock from Blackfoot on lead guitar, and they had Huey Thomason of the Outlaws in there. So I think there's some instances where you can have one original member if you're bringing in sort of superstar quality and sort of look at it like it's a super group. At least for me, like I've gone and seen Skinner with only the one original member kind of thing. I'm okay with that, but I'm also there to see the other famous people that are there.
Right.
So for me, at least, that works.
And I want to talk about, that's an interesting thing, because I want to talk about a time when that didn't work. And I'm thinking of Motorhead.
Okay.
And they had the album Another Perfect Day. And at this point, Fast Eddie Clarke was out of the band. And they brought in Brian Robo Robertson from Thin Lizzy.
Yeah.
And it just didn't work because he had a whole different look and sound, like a physical look that just worked with Motorhead.
Yeah, he was a much cleaner player, and his appearance, and just like, I don't know, I saw some of those photos and stuff, and
he had a headband on.
Yeah, and it's like the other guys are in leather and studs and everything. And
but you would think like, oh hey, let's take Brian Robertson from Thin Lizzy. I mean, he's a very famous, guitar player, and let's plug him in here. Sometimes that just doesn't work. So it's almost better sometimes to maybe take somebody who's not in a big band, almost like a no-name person, and plug them in.
Well, right. I mean, I think that worked with Ripper Owens stepping in for Rob Halford. Right. They could have brought in a famous singer, and I don't know if that would have worked. They brought in somebody who sounded very similar to Rob Halford, but was fantastic in his own right. And it just, happened to work there. So moving down the numbers here, what about bands that have no original members, right? So we have a few of them that are out right now. Quiet Riot is out there, no original members. At one point, there was a version of LA Guns out there, and they did put out this album here, Paul Black's LA Guns, and Paul Black sang for the band before Phil Lewis, who recorded on the first album. So yes, Paul Black was a member, but never recorded a studio album like the debut that you see behind me and continuing on. So in essence, there were no members from the known lineup that people knew. And the other example is this: Blackfoot is continued with no original members. Ricky Medlock, the original guitarist and vocalist, co-writes with them and produces them, but he selected all four guys to be Blackfoot and go out and play under the name. It's like his own tribute band, but he no longer plays with them or anything. And I find it to be really odd. I'm kind of torn between it. We were talking a little bit about this before we got started here. And I'll give my sort of rationale behind Quiet Riot, in that they're sort of like a super group. And I don't go, or I'm not so interested in them under the name Quiet Riot. They say they're going to record, and I'm going to buy the album, but not because it says Quiet Riot on it. I'm going to buy it for the super group of members. We've got Jizzy Pearl on vocals from Love Hate. Of course, he also fronted Rat. He fronted LA Guns for a while. We've got Typo Negative guy doing the drumming in there. Alex Grossi is on guitar. He was actually the last guitar player in the lineup when Kevin Dubrow and Frankie Bannerly were still, out touring as original members of the group, sort of thing. So it's sort of like you've got this lineup, and now you've got Rudy Sarzo back in the lineup. People call him an original member because he does play on Metal Health, which is their most famous album and sort of debut to the world, but actually not part of the original band when they put out 2 albums in Japan. But, when you take those 4 musicians and put them together, I'm curious what they're going to come up with. So I'm excited about that. But I also understand why they're doing it under the Quiet Riot name. There's more name recognition there than if these 4 guys decided to change their name, although they could change their name and call themselves Metal Health or something, I think I know your answer on this, but what's your take, just so that all the people watching can hear you?
I don't think it's fair to the fans, because for someone like you and I, if you do research on these bands and you know what you're getting yourself into, like when you buy that Quiet Riot record and you realize, oh, there's going to be no original members, that's fine. But for the general listener, they're like, even for me, like if I bought that LA Guns CD and realized that Phil Lewis wasn't in there and Tracy Guns was not a member anymore, I'd be pissed. Or if you bought tickets to go see a show and you're thinking you're going to go see Quiet Riot, at least see one of the members, and then see nobody. I don't know. It's almost like you're trying to pull the wool over the fans' eyes a little bit.
And to some degree, I agree with that, because that's where that idea of name recognition comes from. Most fans or people who listen to music don't follow who's in a band, and they just see, oh, Quiet Riot is coming to town. Let's go see them do that famous song.
Yeah.
So in a way, you are pulling the wool over, someone's eyes. But at the same time, I also say, they have a right to do it. These guys in the band were playing with Frankie Banali, who owned the name, who got it from Kevin Dubrow. So it's been passed down. And when he was dying of cancer, he wrote his will out and he left it to the remaining members of the band to continue to go out and do it. They had put the time and energy in the band with him, making or continuing the effort with the name. And on that side of things, I say, yeah, they have a right to that. And I appreciate that Frankie Banali, the drummer, was willing to do that, to not say, sorry, now that I'm gone, you don't get to use this anymore. But it is an odd thing. I just have to say, in all of these cases, fans should always be, wary and check things out. But touching on that, there were 4 versions of LA Guns at one time. So we had the Paul Black one that I showed you. Currently, we've got Stephen Riley, the drummer, who then brought the bass player Kelly Nichols back in. So 2 original members. Did come out under the name LA Guns, although in a lawsuit now they have to call themselves Riley's LA Guns. So there is going to be a different name to that. Tracy Guns put a version together where he was the only original one at one time. Jizzy Pearl was singing in this lineup. And then this is when Phil Lewis, the vocalist, along with Steve Riley, the drummer, were in their own version before Steve Riley and Phil Lewis had the falling out. So it's like, at times you didn't know who you were seeing when you go out there. Now, I'm a fan of all these guys, and I followed all 5 of the members of LA Guns from the start in, 88. So for me, it's like, I'm interested in it all, either which way. And I have different reasons for why I like it. If Steve Riley was the only person playing in his version, I might not be so interested in that. But he brought Kelly Nichols back in on bass, and Kelly Nichols always had a big, foot in everything. He even sang lead on one of their albums on one of the tracks. So he was a little bit more than just a bass player, co-wrote. They brought in, I forget his name, I'm drawing a blank on it. They brought in a guitar player, I think his name was Muddy, who used to be their bass player in other versions of LA Guns. So even though, again, not original members, 3 of the guys that are in there have been in LA Guns. And then they added a 4th guy, a guitar player, who's not played, been with them at all. So as a fan who has followed them for the 34 years now, I am well aware of those 3 of those guys in different versions. So the fact that they're together in this, I look at it and say there's 3 versions of or 3 members of LA Guns, and I get excited by that. But I'm also know everything else about it, meaning that the vocalist isn't, Phil Lewis, and it's not Jizzy Pearl, who one time filled in, who's, semi-famous in his own right, and so forth. So maybe okay, because I can accept those things knowing them. But if I, like you, were a fan who showed up and then Phil Lewis wasn't up on stage, I'd be really bummed. I'd be like, what did I just pay for in this fake version of LA Guns?
Well, it gets confusing for the fans too. Like you just showed, there's 4 different versions of LA Guns and 4 different CDs. It's like, that's really confusing for the fans.
Yeah, I mean, we had that with Queensryche, the Jeff Tate version of the band, and the one without Jeff Tate.
And it takes away from the legacy of the band. It almost makes it a joke, sort of. You know what I mean? It's you like, for me, I can't take LA Guns that seriously anymore if there's like 4 different versions of them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and Great White's doing the same thing. You've got the version that they play under Jack Russell's Great White, but again, until there was a lawsuit, he used to tour under the name Great White, while the other guys toured under it, minus him. I happen to be fans of the original band. So for me, in a lot of cases, if the singer goes off and does his own version and the other 3 or 4 guys with just a new singer, I'm kind of okay. And I'll go see both versions. It's when it gets down to just 1 or 2 members, or the drummer, or the drummer and just bassist. For me, it's like, you got to have something signature about it. You've got to have the guitar player. You've got to have the vocalist. You really need one of the key writers who still writes in that style. So I think we know where we're going with this. We'll kind of wrap this up now, but bottom line on this, sort of final question. Do you feel like or think that a band has a right to continue to use a name, its band name, after changing members?
I think in some cases they do. And I want to point out a band that I saw live, Black Flag, and very famous punk band. But when I went to see them a couple of years ago, there was only one original member, and it was the guitar player, Greg Ginn.
Right.
The reason I went to go see them was because he created their signature sound. Mm-hmm. And I knew what I was getting myself into. I knew I was basically going to see a Greg Ginn solo show under the name Black Flag. But I feel like in that case, he can continue that name and can continue that band, because he was, even though there's one member left, he was one of the original members. So I think in some cases it does work.
And I agree with that. I mean, the album that you held up there, I think, was that one with Henry Rollins on it?
This is with Henry Rollins, right? Yep.
But Henry Rollins wasn't the original vocalist either. So even though he's the most famous person to have come out of that band, and a lot of people would say, oh, if there's no Henry Rollins, there's no Black Flag. But he wasn't the original vocalist either. And I'm surprised that, I don't know when you went and saw them, but the original vocalist is back with them.
Well, they're under another name. They go by Flag, just Flag.
Oh, interesting.
They've got Keith Morris on vocals. He was the original vocalist. He went on to the Circle Jerks.
Okay.
And I believe that the original Black Flag drummer, Bill Stevenson, is playing with Flag. So there's two versions of Black Flag. There's Black Flag and then there's Flag.
Interesting. So I think he made one album with Greg Ginn and Keith Morris back together, if I'm not mistaken, because that's the one that I was interested in. Or it's with Keith Morris, because I know it's the original vocalist, and it's under the name Black Flag, but then they must have had a lawsuit or something and have to play under Flag now. But that's interesting. Now, see, now I wasn't aware of that. I'm going to have to look into that, because I'm also a Black Flag fan, and I didn't realize there were two versions of that group going around. But you have to do your homework. So, all right, everyone. I think we've kind of beat this as a dead horse here, kind of thing. But I think it really comes down to there's certain circumstances it works and certain ones it doesn't. And I think the thing is that you just have to do your homework before you go out and buy a brand new album. Just because you see the cover and it says the name, you probably want to check and see who's playing on it these days, unless you're big major fans like both Chris and I are, and you just want to have, everything that your favorite band has done. Do your homework. That's the thing that I would basically say here. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Chris, thank you for joining me on this again.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And certainly everyone who's watching, head on over to Chris Propfe's channel and check him out. He's got a really great channel of his own. I'm going to leave a link in the description below, and you can go check out what he has to do. Obviously, he's the biggest in the vinyl thing. So if you're a huge vinyl fan, do go check him out. I'm the CD guy in this. So we are the CD and vinyl guys. Thanks for joining. Take care, and we'll talk to you all real soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.